We are live. Welcome everyone to ACDE number 195. I'll put the agenda in the chat here. There's a bunch of stuff to go over today. Updates on the DevNets, lots of specific updates or proposed changes for 7702. One issue that was brought up around EOF, around Xcode size and delegate call, and then getting some updates on the DevNets there. And then lastly, there were two more proposals for changes related to the stuff that's already in Pectra. So one for EIP 7251, and then one for the engine API. Assuming we get through all this, then there's three proposals that we have on the agenda. The first is 7623, which we CFI'd for Pectra already, increasing the call data cost in certain cases. Second is 7742, which is about having the blob count only set on the CL side. We discussed this last week on the CL call. And then lastly, there's a pre-EIP idea around raising the reserve price for blobs. So hopefully we have the time to get through all of this. Maybe to kick us off, Barnabas or Perry, do either of you want to give us an update on the current state of DevNet 2 and what the plans are for DevNet 3?
Yeah, so the current state of DevNet 2 is pretty much still on the interop channel. We haven't been able to recover the network. There was a gets bug last week that's since been patched, but that's led to at least one or two other bugs, one in Prism and the other one in Teku. If someone from the team is there, maybe they can briefly go through what the bugs are. Or are they still active on it? I think they're still active. At least the Prism one, Radek has said that he was able to narrow it down, but I think the Teku one might still be actively under triage. Yeah, either ways, we haven't been able to get the network back up and running, but at this stage, I think we're going to just leave it at this level and figure out what the bugs are. We're waiting on client teams to have to pass all the tests before we can launch the next network, so DevNet 3. And there was a spec test release yesterday by Mario, and I think if Mario's there, maybe he can just quickly speak about the spec test.
Yeah, of course. There's not much to talk about. There's a couple of interesting test cases there, which I think should be clarifications in the EIP. I will try to, if no one else is working on it, I will try to make a PR to the EIP to make these clarifications. But other than that, I think it's just 7702 focused released. Yeah, I think Ethereum.js is passing because we filled the test with them. Reth yesterday sent a message that they were passing on our EVM, but they have to port it to Reth. And the rest of the teams, I think, are working on it. But yeah, if you guys have any updates, it would be nice to know.
Yeah, I think Oliver mentioned that they've done it and they have a branch ready for us to use. So yeah, we're mainly just waiting on client teams to pass the spec test, and then once they're ready, we're ready to launch the network. That's the current status.
Got it. And so we won't relaunch DevNet 2 basically. We'll just move on to DevNet 3 once we have confidence that the new test suites are all passing.
Exactly, because most of the issues that were triggered in DevNet 2 were 7702 related, so there was no real reason to fix it.
Got it. And then in terms of the spec changes for DevNet 3, I saw there's a doc, but are there any other notable additions?
I think the only big change is 7702, and on the CL side, we've done a few changes with the consolidation bug, etc. But as far as the CL side is concerned, I think those changes were decided weeks ago, and nothing has changed there. And for the EL side, we've switched to pinning to a specific spec test release version. I will just update that right now to whatever Mario released last night. But essentially, if you're passing spec tests, you're probably okay.
Awesome. Anyone else have updates or questions, concerns about DevNet 2 or the path towards DevNet 3? No, 7212 is not considered for DevNet 3. Um, and then I assume, like, yeah, once we get all the teams passing the spec test, we'll launch the DevNet hopefully in the next week or so. Is that realistic? Is there any team that thinks that, say by next Thursday, they could not be ready to launch DevNet 3? Okay, sweet. Well, yes, let's continue chatting about this as we fix the bugs on Discord. But thanks a lot, Perry, and thanks everyone for the work, yeah, on all of the implementations. Um, okay, next up, 7702. So we have 3 open PRs on it that I want to make sure we discuss, and then potentially make a call on including in DevNet 3 if we decide to. The first is around the behavior of self-destruct in 7702 by Sudeep. I think I saw you on the call. Yeah. You want to give some context on your PR?
Yeah, that's just a clarification being included in the IP. I think the execution spec tests is already following that behavior where we restrict the self-destruct of EOAs. So just a clarification being added, and I think there's a general acceptance to it. So it's just an FYI being floated here.
Okay, so the execution test that Mario just shared, like the last version, which is already in DevNet 3, followed this behavior, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, cool. Any questions, comments on this? And then maybe we should just have it in the list for clarity. So I don't think, I don't think it's part of the DevNet 3 spec. So I would maybe just add this one as well to make it clear, especially if it's already in the test. Okay, the next up, Ethan had 2 PRs. He's unfortunately not on the call. I'll go with the first one, which was about changing the signature domain for 7702. So using 0x1a instead of 0x05. Basically, in his post, he explains that this would allow future transaction types to use 0x05, and then if we ever get past 0x18, we already have some issues because 0x19 is already allocated. I don't know if anyone's reviewed this or has strong opinions. Lightline commented that he was, indifferent, but yeah, generally in favor. But anyone else have thoughts on this? I guess if we did do this, do we want to do this for DevNet 3? Because it's like a pretty small change, but I assume it affects a lot of different parts of the code base. Okay, yeah, and there's one comment about waiting. Daniel?
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to say the same. So, I mean, the change in the count base, I assume for everybody is very small because it's just changing a constant. But we have to change all the spec tests afterwards because because all the signatures are changing. So I don't know how much work this would be.
Yeah, it shouldn't be that hard. They should be dynamically updated once we update like this one constant. It should be one line.
Okay.
But yes, the filling process, it takes an hour. That will be the longest wait, I think.
So would people agree that we should do this change, but then maybe just plan it for DevNet 4 or something? Is that reasonable? Okay, and then like Klein says, he'd want to look a little bit more into the prefixes, and but then generally assumes it's okay. So, okay, then in that case, yeah, let's not do it for DevNet 3. let's just leave the PR open, a bit more for people to review in the next week or two, and then when we're scoping DevNet 4, we can we can formally add this in. And if there's any concerns, then people can just debate this on the PR. Any other comments or thoughts on this? Okay. And then last 7702 PR, this one was by Dragan, which wanted to restrict the chain ID to either valid existing chain IDs or zero. I don't know, Dragan, are you on the call?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In general, we are still having that. Currently, we are having that check inside EVM. I want to move that check outside of EVM and for it to be validation of transactionability. We already have some checks on the signature, and this will be one additional check on chain ID. It will make any authorization list that has authorization with chain ID that's different from the current chain ID or zero be invalid.
Any concerns or objections with the general proposal? If not, I guess one question I have is, are there some cases where like testing this could be more complicated? I assume not, but yeah.
There will be need for some tests just to cover this case.
Yeah.
And that's why I would like to do it after DevNet 3.
Yeah.
But this is very localized and small change, to be honest. There are some tests, I think Mario is maybe better to say this, but there's some tests that covering different chain IDs inside the authorization list. Those needs to be changed, and one or two tests needs to be added. Check this case.
Yeah, I agree. While it seems easy enough to test, I wouldn't include this in DevNet 3 because, yeah, it needs additional testing. Should be small enough, though.
Okay, and then there's a comment by Light Client saying that we shouldn't make the validity of the transaction dependent on the validity of the authorization list. But I guess maybe one question I'd have is that, like previously we just cared that this was like a 256-bit integer. I guess we already have some restrictions on this, so I don't know if you have access to a mic, but it might be good to just expand that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, constraining the inputs based on a data type of integer is different than constraining the input based on chain data, fork configuration data. So I don't feel like we should be combining the fork data into this kind of like serialization logic of the auth list.
Got it.
Yeah, there's a difference between stuff that things that are invalid because they can't be deserialized and things that could be authorizations that could be deserialized, but then like aren't valid as authorizations. And like if someone on Ethereum gives you an authorization with chain ID 3, like you could deserialize it, but it's not a valid authorization, so it doesn't authorize anything.
This is very similar what we are doing with transaction signatures. Basically, we make it invalid if S is more than half of the field and if the V is not in correct format. So it's not a lot different from having those checks.
Right, but those checks are again based on like, I don't know, data types or like, data like constraints less than like domain types. Is that correct? Like I assume the the signature data is like formatted the same across all the chains. Um, and we want to check that it's like a valid format, but that's different than checking that like it's a valid signature on this chain, for example.
Authorization list enables us to have those checks inside EVM. For the signature on the transaction level, that was not the case. That's why it's optionally, we have option to make those checks inside EVM. But what I'm arguing is we shouldn't do that. We should do it when we are deserializing the LP and making those checks before. To not have invalid data inside authorization list. Not just invalid, but data that we can check easily, that we know that are not going to pass.
I guess, does anyone else have strong opinions on this? And and then Yoav has a chat comment saying that otherwise there's like if we do this change, there's a potential DOS vector where we have end transactions using the same authorization, which can be invalidated in O1. Yoav, do you want to maybe expand on what you see as the issue here?
I just acknowledged what Light Client wrote about not making the validity of the transaction depend on the validity of the authorizations, because I mean, as long as the EOA that sent the transaction can pay for it, the transaction is valid. It should be included, even if the authorizations themselves are invalid, because otherwise you could invalidate. You could have a DOS vector where you send a large number of transactions, all of them using a certain authorization, and then you can invalidate the authorization with a single transaction and cause many transactions to become invalid after propagated. So the validity of the transaction should only depend on the sending EOA, not the authorizations. It's okay for authorizations to fail. The transaction is still valid. I think that's what Light meant, right?
Just want to address DDoS claim. I don't think that's valid, because even when you receive the section, you still need to do recovery of it to check validity of the section. Work to check recovery, to do recovery and check those basically is a lot bigger than just iterating on authorization list.
I mean that the authorization can become invalid because it is nonce dependent, right? So if you send 1,000 transactions and all of them have the same authorization, and after the nonce gets incremented, all of the transactions except one become invalid. That's what I meant about
That's true, but we are not talking about now only for chain ID, not about nonce, and not about if the signature is valid or not valid. We are talking about validity of chain ID.
Yeah, that's fine. About chain ID, that's fine. I meant the validity. I thought that what Light Client meant was about the validity in general, and I think that the validity should not depend. The validity should not depend on the validity of authorizations. It's okay to just these authorizations just won't work, but the transaction will still go through. Doesn't that make sense?
It does, but this is not something that we are discussing now.
Yeah.
We are talking about just checking chain ID.
Yes. Okay.
Right. And so, okay, just to be clear, like, yes, this would
What
not.
is different?
Oh, sorry, please go ahead. We can't hear you really well.
Sorry. I don't understand what the difference is. I thought that we were talking about the validity of the transaction.
As I understand it, what we're talking about here is when should so we check the chain at some point. We have to check that the chain ID of the authorization is valid, i.e., it's either the current chain ID or it's 0, so it's valid on a chain. The question is, should that check happen before accepting the transaction? So if the authorization, if the chain ID is invalid, the entire transaction is non-includable, or should it happen after the transaction is accepted, so the transaction is included in the chain and I assume then immediately fails because the authorization is invalid? My kind of feeling on this is it probably doesn't matter, because like transactions that include, if you have a transaction for chain A that includes an authorization for chain B, that transaction is like trivially malformed for like under some trivial static check that doesn't require you to know anything. It's like obviously wrong. So anyone who signed such a transaction has already screwed up really badly, and I'm expecting that like it will be basically impossible to create these sorts of transactions using like any sort of standard tooling. It's not a mistake that people are going to make in reality. But on the other hand, the check is like so trivially cheap that like if we say reject the entire transaction if the authorization is invalid, makes sense. The only concern I would have, which would lead me against this, is that currently all of the checks you have to do to make sure that the authorization is valid are completely chain agnostic. Like either the RLP bytes you get given are an encoding of an authorization object, or they're not an encoding of an authorization object. And the only check you have to do is you decode it with the RLP, and if your RLP decoder throws you in error, then it's invalid. Whereas what this does is it makes the validity of the authorization. Yes, I did get married, Maris. Makes the authorization invalid. Validity as a decoding exercise depend on what the chain ID is of the current chain. And that just seems like adding a little bit of complexity, whereas we're going to check the entire authorization anyway in a minute after we've accepted the transaction.
Okay, I think, yeah, clearly there's probably a bit more thinking to be done here. And because this is not going to be added to DevNet 3, it's probably fine to move this conversation async. So there's the PR there. And I think in the next ACDA, we can just, if it's not merged or closed by then, follow up on it. But yeah, we do have other stuff on the agenda. So unless there's any like pressing comments or thoughts on this, I think we should probably just move on. Okay. Yeah, and thanks for bringing this up, Dragan. Okay, anything else on 7702 before we move on from that EIP? If not, EOF. So I forget, Frangio Giordano, Francisco Giordano, I hope I said your name right, put together this doc with some concerns about EOF and especially how it behaves with regards to token transfers for NFTs. Do you want to take a minute to maybe walk through your doc and what the concerns are? I know it's been discussed a bit on the Discord in the past couple of days as well.
Yeah, sure. So first, as a preface, I'm very excited about EOF improvements to static analysis and code generation. So I feel like that's important context. I think these are just improvements to make. So I do have these concerns that come from the application layer. So ERC 721 and ERC 1155 are the two major NFT standards. And essentially, they need an is contract operation to because of some behavior that they have on transfers. So when a token is transferred to an account, if the receiver is a contract, it has to sort of explicitly declare that it supports receiving this token by implementing a callback. And the token contract will invoke this callback and expect some special value in return. This is only done for contracts. So if the receiver does not have any code, it's assumed to be an EOA, and the token is just transferred without calling any callbacks. Yeah. So the purpose of this check is to prevent the loss of tokens, which are transferred to contracts that can't handle them. This is an error that happens a lot. And so it's kind of debatable, does it belong in the EVM or not? But the fact is these two ERCs, which are final, already specified, they require this operation. So what that means is that in EOF, which does not have ext code size or ext code hash, it is not possible to implement this. So the current proposal is to work around that by dispatching to a legacy contract as a sort of escape hatch to get ext code size. This is possible, this works, but it is a bit of a hurdle for library authors because now they have to hard code this address or in the code that they ship to users. We as an ecosystem have to make sure that those addresses are widely deployed and available everywhere, which in its own is its own issue because there's like no 100% reliable way to get deterministic addresses across all chains. And then there's also the problem of like development chains on users' local computers, which also have to have that. So anyway, it's a big issue. So in my opinion, this needs to be addressed just in EOF. The fact that it can be worked around in this way so easily, and also the fact that these two main standards require that, so it is going to be used widely. This sort of escape hatch mechanism, to me, just says, well, why don't we just enable these opcodes, ext code size and or ext code hash in EOF, and just fix that so that all of this workaround is not required. This is one issue. The other issue that I described in the notes here is regarding delegate call. There's currently a limitation to so EOF contracts cannot delegate call into legacy contracts, and this, in my opinion, it quite realistically cause some bricked contract bricking situations. That could become sort of like a new parity wallet situation where a proxy that is working perfectly is like accidentally upgraded from an EOF contract to a legacy contract, and then it becomes unusable, completely frozen, and it would require some sort of, well, or no recovery at all would be possible. So it's not really clear why this limitation is in place. That I think it's about just avoiding things that in EOF contracts that are not supposed to happen there. For example, anything related to self-destruct. Recently, there was a proposal for 7702 to sort of change the behavior of self-destruct. In that context, that there's now a discussion to apply it in EOF as well, and to just sort of lift this restriction and just allow delegate calling into legacy contracts, and that would prevent this situation. But this is sort of related to the previous issue because if we had ext code hash, we could implement at least a check to prevent the situation in the code itself to see if the target that we would be delegate calling into is EOF or not by using ext code hashes behaviors. It just allows you to detect that. So these are the two issues that are sort of related to ext code size and hash, and delegate call is its own discussion. And we've been talking about this in the EOF implementers call, but so far no change has been made, and we're sort of heading towards the status quo. And I think it would be better to make a deliberate decision that with like convincing arguments as to why choose one thing or the other. I'm happy to hear any opinions.
Thanks for sharing. Dano?
So we've got a couple constraints we've been working with EOF to get it to ship. One of them is there was feedback given from multiple people in ACD that we should strip out absolutely everything that is not absolutely necessary to ship it, and we come back in future releases and add those features in. So any feature that didn't involve breaking something that could be added additively in a future hard fork is something we made a conscious decision not to put in to reduce the scope and the testing impact of EOF. This is one of them, how to detect a contract. We can add that with a is contractor unlocking the old opcodes in a future fork. There's also a couple of other features. TX create, which allows us to create transactions from to create new EOF objects arbitrarily from transactions, was also removed, as well as consideration for EXT data copy, which allows us to copy data from other EOF contracts. Those were pulled because those can easily be added in future in the next hard fork. We can add those opcodes in without breaking EOF, without invalidating any other contracts. So that's been our guiding North Star for at least EOF v1 to see what goes in and what goes out. And while this issue with building 721 or 1155 contract in EOF, it does kind of prevent it right now from following the specs. It doesn't break anything outside of EOF. You can continue to write these contracts in legacy, and we can add these opcodes in the next hard fork, and then you can start writing them in EOF. So that's kind of been our philosophy of why we chose the status quo. But if we get feedback from ACD that this is important to fix now, we'll work harder on the consensus as the EOF implementer is called to get it into this release. But my overriding concern is ACD is already concerned about the size of this release as it is.
And I guess maybe in that case, assuming we did add those, more features like in a future version, if something did get bricked through like some weird update, like we were just talking about, is that something where then exposing that functionality in EOF allows you to make the same calls you made in legacy VM and therefore sort of unbrick the contract?
So that's the case of the delegate call limitation. Yeah. We originally put that in. Yeah. Mostly it was around self-destruct, but in generally it's around any feature and any operation that we banned inside of EOF. Self-destruct is the most easy one to demonstrate. But when it comes to the other opcodes that we're banning inside EOF, as Frangio pointed out, you can just do a regular non-delegate call to get ext code copy and pass it in as return data. So a lot of those have non-delegate call solutions. I think only self-destruct and the side effects are what is impacted by it. And we didn't want to propose changes to self-destruct, but with 7702, that cat's out of the bag. And you can write your proxy contract to do the EOF detection via those jumper calls if you feel it's important to have your proxy in EOF. But I think until we get these features, you shouldn't write a proxy in EOF. Those will come down the line and we'll get those addressed.
Yeah, Frangio?
Yeah, I feel like there's a significant difference between something like TX create, which is a actually new thing, versus something like ext code size, where it's just it's not additional effort. Well, that's easy to say, but it's not like a difference from legacy contracts. And in my view, we're making all this effort to ship EOF now. While removing stuff is good, it's also good to make it useful and ensure adoption so that all of this effort pays off. My concern is that with these limitations, it's going to really harm this adoption in languages and libraries, and we're not going to really kind of reap the benefits. So in the direction of like reducing it as much as possible, the simplest possible fix would be to just enable ext code size, and I think that'll be a much better situation for EOF to get adopted.
Ben?
Probably code hash also, because then you can actually detect it's an EOF contract specifically, whereas you can't do that with code size alone. because code size would say, oh, it's 2 bytes, but that doesn't tell you it's EOF 2 bytes if you're worried about proxies detection.
So one of the things that we're developing in the EOF implementers is we don't have the PR out yet, but we're contemplating an is contract opcode. And one of the design options is to have it return 0.1 or 0.12. 0 for legacy, no, 0 for EOA, 1 for legacy, and 2 for EOF. So in one opcode, we solve both of these problems. But there's other design issues we want to make sure we're covering the spaces and not pulling back on some of our commitment to remove code introspection. Because if we just blindly turn on the XT code hash, the XT code size, and the XT code copy, we probably don't need copy. But I mean, if we're removing the other EXT code, there's going to be a lot of pressure to say, well, why don't you just do code copy? All of a sudden, we're needing to keep all of the old bytecode, or at least metadata about the bytecode, as was originally implemented, which is going to make things difficult for ZK systems because they'll need to keep some extra data. But there's already issues around that anyway with calculating the addresses. So we're discussing this in our chats, and I mean, we could, if it was just as simple as just flipping an opcode or implementing one other thing, I'd be a bit more willing to push the rest of the implementers to a solution. But I think one of the big issues is we don't have the exact solution that's going to solve all of our commitments, and fixing in a subsequent fork gives us the space that we need to make sure that we're doing the right thing, not necessarily the time-forced thing. And as far as, if we're shipping something that devs can't use, 95% of contracts never need to know if you're calling an EOF or EOA. The exceptions is the 1155s and the 721s. But if you're calling Uniswap, it's presumed your contract. The callbacks, they work. It's a lot of the contracts and smart contract use cases that go with this. These features are not essential and are not breaking. So that's, we're covering 80-90% of the people who could use it. You could deploy Uniswap today and not have any of this concern.
So I guess maybe one related thing to think about is just like, how far along EOF is right now, what the diff is to add these features and over what timeline, because there's clearly like a design space to explore here, whereas we've been kind of exploring the rest of the design space for quite some time now. So I guess, I don't know if Daniel, you're the right person to give this updates, but like in terms of the EOF DevNets, like where are we at now? How stable are the implementations? And then, like, what do you think it would take to like add these opcodes? Yeah.
So the big issue for the opcodes, aside from coming to consensus on what the correct solution is we need to write tests for them.
Yeah.
And that is a couple of days to write the tests, and then all the clients need to implement the code and conform with the tests. As far as DevNet 4 readiness, we're at least 2 weeks out. The clients aren't 100% on tests right now. Every client has at least one test that they're failing. Some of them it's because there's some of the specs have been changing underneath it a little bit. And they had, implemented it to a spec that was correct a year ago. Those are some of the issues that they're working with. Plus, the work on 7702 is taking a lot of engineers' time right now. How things are getting basically designed on the fly. It's taking a lot of their time to re-implement these changes. So as far as readiness, I think we can be ready for when DevNet 4 ships. Adding the opcode would push us back probably about a week for DevNet 4 at least.
Okay. My sense is that, given EOF is already such a huge change, I would lean towards integrating the version that we're already testing thoroughly as a first version in DevNets before we add anything more. And then, potentially in parallel, start targeting sort of an EOF, extension that we can potentially add in, say, DevNet 5 or something if DevNet 4 goes smoothly. But my biggest fear here is this is already such a massive change, and that if we just try to add everything now and constantly keep changing the spec, we don't even get to a point where like clients have a stable implementation of like the current spec that we can test. And yeah, it does seem like we don't necessarily need to make a decision on this now, but ideally before we ship, we should have like taken the right decision here. Does that make sense to people? Any objections or concerns with that? Okay, sweet. In that case, what's the best place to continue the conversation around like the specific issues? I know that people have been using like the EVM channel. That seems right, and I assume there's another EOF implementers call. If not next week, the week after. Is that right? Yeah, next week there is one.
Yeah, the EOF implementer calls are opposite weeks of ACDE.
Okay.
So it'll be Wednesday. And EOF, the EVM channel is a great place to do that. I'd like the Epsilon team to get that draft out as soon as they think it's ready, preferably as soon as possible, so we can have discussion on what their ideas are for how we can address that. So yeah, that's the best place to continue this. And I do like the idea of doing DevNet 4 with what we have right now, and then contemplating whether we add this in Pectra or whether it becomes a Fusaka target.
Yeah, that sounds good. Any other concerns, comments about EOF or the specific change? Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Frangio, for coming on and sharing the doc. Moving on, we have a proposed change. It's the CL change to fix the correlation penalties that Mikael put together, and he just wanted to get a last call on people reviewing this. I don't think Mikael's on the call today, but if anyone else has comments or context they want to share about this, please do.
I can say a little bit.
Yep.
Yeah, it's kind of fixes an edge case with the penalties on the CL around slashing under the max EV change. And yeah, if especially CL teams could just take a look at the PR and approve, ideally, that'd be great. But yeah, it should be in a pretty good place. So I guess the ask is just for CL teams to take a look.
Is this something we would merge into DevNet 3 or DevNet 4?
Good question. I would just say it'll land in the CL specs release when it's ready, and then from there we can just see which DevNet is ready.
Okay.
It shouldn't, yeah, it doesn't really matter. This isn't something we're gonna hit in testing, at least in DevNet 3 or 4.
Okay, sounds good. So yeah, let's try and get this reviewed async and then merge before next week's call, ideally. Next up, we have a proposal by Light Client to unify request objects in the engine API. There's been a fair bit of discussion on it with the last comments coming after the start of this call, right at the start of this call. I don't know, Light Client, do you want to give some context on this? And if others after that want to chime in, that'd be great. If not, as I understand it, is that the current design requires EL clients to be aware of the fork schedule through the engine API, and this design would, I believe, remove that requirement, but there was a recent comment that came right at the start of this call saying that it seems like the EL actually needs to be aware regardless because of some old methods. Any comments, thoughts? If not, we can also continue the discussion on the PR and potentially give people another week to review it. Yeah, in that case, let's move on. Okay, so Pectra EIPs. Um, we had 7623, which was proposed a while back and then subsequently CFI'd. Tony wanted to ask about including this in the hard fork. Similarly, Alex had an EIP to decouple the blob count between the EL and the CL. And then lastly, Max has a proposal to update the blob reserve gas price. And so it's probably worth going over each of these in more details, but I just wanted to flag that it does seem like we have a fair amount of small proposals that people still want to put in the fork. There's others that we've discussed on previous calls, like 7212, for example. So if making decisions, we should make them in the context of none of these are the only thing we potentially want to add as a small addition to Pectra. And I mean, we're just discussing a couple new opcodes for EOF as well. So to start, I don't know, Tony, you're on the call. Do you want to give a bit of context on 7623 and any thoughts you want to share there?
Yeah, sure. As a reminder, EIP 7623 proposes to increase the call data cost for call data heavy transactions. And the main motivation to do so is to reduce the size of the EL payload. Because already today we see certain big blocks, and with big we're talking about 400 kilobytes, that receive way less attestations and are then more often reorged. And also today the median or the mean block size is around 100 kilobytes plus blobs, but the maximum size is 3.5 megabytes, so 100 kilobytes versus 3.5 megabytes. And as you can see, this is super volatile, and by increasing the call data cost, we can basically reduce it. Also, I think the EIP is in a good position now because we have blobs. All rollups are using blobs already, so no one relies on using call data for data storage on chain. Yeah, as Tim said, the EIP is considered for inclusion, and I would propose that we include it in DEFnet 4. The EIP itself is super small. The EL specs are done, and I think Marius also started implementing it in Geth. And yeah, would love to hear what the core devs think about it.
So there's two comments saying that they see the EIP as addressing a vulnerability. I assume this is the fact that we can have these huge heavy blocks on the network, and then a +1 from Nethermind for the EIP. Any other thoughts, comments? Okay, lots of +1s for the EIP. I guess, okay, before we make a call about this, it's probably worth at least going over the two other proposals just to see how much support they have. And then if we, if this is the one people feel strongest about and they think we should still include stuff, we can, we can decide to include it and figure that out. But yeah, before we make that decision, Alex, do you want to talk about 7742?
Sure. So I think most people have seen this EIP in some sense already, but ultimately, so today how it works is there's a target value for the blobs that we want in the protocol and a maximum value. And right now, both these parameters are specified both on the CL and EL. So, a couple of things this does, at least one thing is that it just couples together like development of both these layers. Also makes it a little more inflexible to change, say target or max wherever we want. So the CIP proposes to uncouple these constants between the EL and CL and essentially have the CL drive the values, then provide them in the necessary way to the EL. So we've gone through a few rounds of feedback, at least more on the CL side of things, and I think the things that are ready to go, meaning the EIP, engine API changes, and the CL specs. So yeah, I think there's generally, I mean, there was really good support from the CL call last week, and yeah, I'd like to hear what EL devs think.
Any thoughts on 7702? Okay, so Reth is in favor, doesn't feel strongly about including it in Pectra or not. Any other?
Yeah, I guess one other comment is that it supports, you know, pure DOS and just generally the blob mechanics. And so, you know, we could imagine coupling this with pure DOS. Then we can decide where pure DOS ultimately lands. I was just saying they want it in pure DOS DevNet 3. It'd be a little messy to like have a separate pure DOS spec, but
no,
we would
have one spec and just point to that basically. So hopefully we could launch like yeah, I'm not sure about the correct order. What we would do, like Pectra DevNet 4 would come first, or PeerDAS DevNet 3. We are currently still waiting for PeerDAS DevNet 2 for client teams to finish the implementation. Once that's somewhat stable, then we can add some additional scope to the PeerDAS testing, which would be also the time when PeerDAS would rebase on top of Electra. So at that point, it would be very nice if we could play around with a different number of blobs in each like different targets and different values, and just experiment of like how it would look in PeerDAS. All we would need is just a single EA to implement this, and then we could use that for testing. And then every other EA could implement this later, or whether we decide to include it in Pectra or not.
Yeah, so there's a comment in the chat by Jergan about potentially leaving decision making for the next ACDE, so people have time to digest. I feel like that might be the right way to go about this, so that we can at least list out all of the like potential additions, and some of them are like formal EIPs. So like 7742, I'm not sure if we've CFI'd it, but it seems like it probably makes sense to CFI that for the fork, given the relatively strong support. But then, in addition to that, potentially list out like the less formalized proposals, like these EOF changes, and potentially what we're about to talk about. Would that make sense to people? Or does anyone feel like there needs to be a decision taken now for either of these? Okay. If not, does anyone object to CFIing 7742 just so we can have it there in the list alongside everything else? So we already have 7212 there, the R1 curve. We still have the inclusion list EIP, which I think we've pretty set that we're not going to do, and we already had 7623. And so, yeah, I think having 7742 there, and then I can put together a list of the other proposals that aren't quite as formalized, and people can review that, and ideally even share their thoughts async prior to the next call. Okay. Yeah, thanks for sharing, Alex. And then last one on the agenda, Max wanted to talk about raising the reserve price for blobs. Max, are you still on the call?
Yeah. So this change would be a one-line diff the reserve price is actually already implemented. It's just that it hasn't been set other than at one way. So it's a one-line diff, just changing that constant to be a value that I proposed. The value was chosen so that the cost of a blob would be pegged to around the cost of a simple transfer, so 21K gas at a 1 GUI base fee. And so that comes out to around like 5 cents USD per blob at today's prices. The goal of the change is not to raise revenue. It would be like, even if we had 3 blobs per block, it would be something like less than 400K a year in total cost if we saturated all the blobs. But the goal is really to have the reserve price be at a point where when blobs do enter price discovery, they do so faster than they do right now. And right now it would take basically 32 minutes to get from 1 way to this level of like reasonable 5 cents per blob because of the way that the updating rule works. And you have to traverse like all these orders of magnitude of fees to get to the right spot, and it just takes a long time to do that with the updating rule. So this would be kind of like a one-line change that addresses that. And of course, the reason that we might want to do this is that there's some chaotic stuff that happens when blobs enter price discovery, where there's a lot of weirdness that goes on the fee markets that we've seen a few times when they do enter price discovery.
Thanks. Ansgar?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that basically the reason why the parameter is in the specs right now but not set was just that we weren't sure it's worth the complexity, and initially we just assumed that blobs would only really go through price discovery once, relatively shortly after shipping for it before, and then would stay above some sort of minimum price from then on out. It turns out that that was not the case. It takes a little bit longer to basically hit that adoption level, and so we might actually go through that phase several times. And we've already done that a few times in the past when demand spiked. And so I personally think it makes a lot of sense. And particularly, I think that Max's specific, I know it's not in the IP yet, but the specific proposal he made seems very sensible to me, because it is actually somewhat important that we hit the right trade-off, that we don't set it too high, because the point specifically is not to raise revenue or anything, or like price gouge or anything like that. It's really just to like shorten the amount, like the time to sensitivity, basically. And so I think basically the proposal as is basically already ideal, and if it was put into a full EIP, I would support it.
Thanks. Ben?
I've not double-checked Max's math, but I'm trusting it. 100 blocks to go from one way to 1 GUI seems like a extraordinary load on the validators for, no unresponsiveness to get to a price that's, pretty low anyway at 1 GUI. So I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and that would be at full load. And actually, there's like a bunch of weirdness that happens. Usually these price spikes happen around when other activity on the chain is high, and when like there's trading going on, the builders don't want to include the blobs. So it actually takes even longer than that, because they're periodically producing blocks without any blobs. So that's it's even longer than that. That's kind of the best case scenario.
Any other thoughts, questions, or comments about the proposal?
Someone mentioned that blobs are not being included for like efficiency reasons related to trading. Is there any concern that we might not get price discovery because like people are so reluctant to include blobs that they're just not being included above the target rate anyway? Because that might suggest we want to do something more sophisticated than just this proposal.
Sorry,
Sorry,
I just clapped instead of raising my hand. I wanted to answer to Peter's question. I don't think that's the case, because at some point rollups will just pay more and more, and it's some point the builder will have an incentive to include them, no matter how big the blobs are.
Yeah, I agree with Tony. The priority fees will start to escalate. There have been some changes in builder API endpoints that allow a more efficient fee market and allow you to basically replace your bid with a higher one with a higher priority fee without rebroadcasting the blob. Whereas before you had to rebroadcast the blob, and in order to prevent like DOS attacks on the network, you had to increase the fee by 100%. So there have been some positive changes in that direction on the builder front. Besides, I think a change like that would probably be too big for Pectra. Any change that's more in the fundamental structure, whereas this is just kind of a one-line change to a parameter.
So I think for this specific proposal, it's clearly worth drafting an EIP and considering it along with the other changes we were just discussing in the next call. Max, do you have the bandwidth to do that in the next, say, week or so?
Yeah, I'll have it
awesome.
ready by the end of the week. Thank you.
Awesome. And I guess one thing related to the 7623 that I wanted to bring up is that Ansgar said, it might be worth considering just a raw call data increase if that's simpler than 7623. I don't know if anyone wants to draft an EIP for that as well for us to consider, or if, Tony, you have thoughts about like if we were to just do a simple quote unquote one-line change instead of 7623, what would that look like?
Yeah, you could basically look up the EAP first version. It started exactly like that by just increasing the call data cost by just 4xing the call data cost for non-zero and 0 bytes. The main problem back then was that the community was basically saying, so I reached out to a lot of community members and teams, and the main feedback I got was that this is kind of then a bigger change because it impacts tooling, because not like in EAP 7623 where 99.9% of the transactions would be unaffected. So every token transfer, any NFT transfer, anything you do with DeFi would be unaffected, not touched. But with a dump increase, you touch basically every transaction. And yeah, this was the main rationale why to do it in a little bit more complex way, but also having the advantage to not touch every transaction. And also there is this follow-up proposal by Vitalik to do it fully multi-dimensional, which is probably something we might want to do in the next years. So I would see 7623 more as the quick fix that is a little bit more sophisticated than the dump increase, but also far away from multi-dimensional gas pricing.
Got it, thanks. Okay, I guess in that case, yeah. We can have people review 7623, and if for whatever reason people think it's too complicated, even though it seems relatively simple, we can cross that bridge when we get there. But thanks, yeah, just wanted to make sure that we touched on that as well. And I think this was everything we had on the agenda for today. Is there anything else people wanted to bring up that we that we didn't get to today? Okay, if not, yeah, we can wrap up here. Thanks everyone, and I'll share a recap shortly after this call. And yes, if people can review all the proposals before next ACDE and ideally share their thoughts about them ahead of time, we can hopefully make some final decisions about the scope for Pectra in 2 weeks. But yeah, thanks for coming on, everybody, and talk to you all soon.
Cheers, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.